Hello everyone, welcome to Theory of Architecture. Firstly, just a reminder that all the interviews I do are also available in video format on YouTube. I like to record the video because sometimes I find it's quite nice to watch the interviews rather than just listen, so please head over to my YouTube channel, that's Buckland Architects. Please subscribe and share the channel with anyone you think might like it. Thanks a lot. Now on with the podcast. My guest today is a green infrastructure professional, a speaker, a photographer, and a nature conservationist. He is currently the president of the European Federation of Green Roof Associations and founder of livingroofs.org. This conversation is all about green roofs, green walls, and green infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dusty Gedge.
I'll try not to be too impolite about architecture.
Oh no, please do be polite. It's much better when people are...
I've got a history. My stepfather was a structural engineer, and I used to go on site doing piles with him, and he was a very gentle, modest man, but architects didn't rate highly in his canon of professionals. So I have that from when I was like 12, 13, you know.
Yeah, well, I don't know, we're not... There's a mixture of people and architects.
No, I don't, you know, it's easy. I've said to everybody, because you get to talk to anybody, I said, it's just really easy in the construction game to blame architects. You know, it just really is easy, yeah.
Well, we also have all the legal liability.
Yeah.
It seems like we have all the legal liability.
Yeah. But it's very hard to sue an architect.
Really?
Well, I did celebrate when I read in the Evening Standard. It was 2 years ago that a developer managed to sue Norman Foster for a hotel.
Successfully?
Yeah, a hotel at Heathrow. And he successfully sued him.
For what?
Completely, what they do, isn't it? I've got to remember the story is, you know, they design it, pay them a lot of money, and then when it goes to the next stage of planning, you know, they fob it off to a lower architect, and this developer didn't know, and obviously he didn't get what went into outline planning, and he got what this detail, and he was fucking apoplectic, this guy, and he went all the way, and I remember he said nobody sues Norman Foster, and he said, well, I have, and I won. I kind of liked him actually.
Yeah, well, hopefully you'll be able to avoid that as in our professional lives as much as possible. But
yeah,
well, we always try and farm off the responsibility to every other consultant, and then every other consultant tries to farm off responsibility to every other consultant.
Yeah.
And we're just witnessing this when you're leading like a design team meeting. It's very almost disheartening, I think.
Yeah. Well, also because I do deal with waterproofers, you know, and people say, oh, why are they insisting on their proprietary system? I said, well, I don't like their proprietary system, but they've got to guarantee the waterproofing. So that's their liability. Yeah, and you've got a kind of empathy. Empathy is always very good in this game.
Yeah. Anyway, we should start. But maybe you can start by outlining what your sort of background is and how you got into green roofs. What you do now. Yeah. Are
you going to ask a question, or shall I just proceed? So, you know, how did I become a president of the European Federation of Green Roof and Wall Associations? Sorry? Yeah. Well, I do say in my talks I went from being a punk to a president because I was a punk years ago for 3 days. Now, I was an actor and a circus performer. That's how I came to London. But ever since I can remember, I've been watching birds. And so I set up a circus workshop down in Deptford, Greenwich, to teach specifically targeted truants to get them off the street who were smoking too many drugs. And I set up this workshop, eventually got funded by Greenwich Council. And the guy who then sort of managed this process was part of a thing called Creekside, which is there's a creek in Deptford. And they wanted a professional bird watcher. And they wanted a local person, and I got this job doing this bird watching survey. And obviously this has got nothing to do with architecture until this moment, because we found this particular bird. It's called the black redstart, which has got a protected status. And it's a material consideration in planning applications to mitigate for a protected species. Well, obviously this whole Creekside area is being regenerated, lots of buildings going up there. And so the only way they could mitigate was we went, well, why don't we shove it on the roof? And it really was like that. Let's just shove it on the roof. And I have no background in the built environment. And so what happened really was a lot of the consultants, big multidisciplinary consultants, the really famous ones, oh, no, you can't do that. It's technically not possible. So I actually, I had a friend of mine who was working at London Wildlife Trust. He sent me an article in German from Switzerland. And I contacted, you've got to remember, this is 22 years ago. I mean, emails were like, late 90s. I mean, sending an email was like pushing a rock up a slope, But I sent an email to a guy called Bernard Zay in Bern. He worked for the Swiss nature body. And he put me in touch with a guy called Dr. Stefan Brunison in Basel. And I paid my own money, flew to Basel in 2000. And I like to say from that moment on, I found out everything technically to be able to put a green roof up. And so I'm president now. I know all the codes of practices. The Italian is the best. There's a really interesting one in Bogota, which we might bring up in Colombia. Ours, most of them are based upon the German. I can quote you 2.453. I can go for, blah, blah, blah. And we've just launched our new UK Green Roof Code, which architects should look at and use. And I don't necessarily agree with everything in these codes because I have this sort of deeper knowledge. And I think what's important is because I come from a plants, insects and birds background, I'm interested in the vegetation, not in the product. Mm-hmm. And I think what would be key for this from a proselytizing point of view is if we're talking about green roofs or any landscape, we should really be talking about the process. What's its functionality, and not give me a product, tick the box and walk away, which unfortunately is what happens 80% of the time when a green roof is specified or designed.
Mm-hmm. Well, would you say you're more encouraged then these days by the level at which more and more people and organisations are engaging with biodiversity and with the sort of the natural environment more generally, and of course climate change as well? Is that something? Are you sort of optimistic that people are genuinely starting to do that rather than just following the guidelines handed on down by government or anything else?
Yeah, it's funny. Just before we started this, I was reading an article about biodiversity net gain by a professor of biodiversity at Oxford University. It's a very interesting article. I am, when you look, and I'm going to kind of segue around this, I started doing all this about 1997. And in my current talks, I have a picture of the Sainsbury's at North Greenwich, which was built in 1999. And it was the most sustainable retail store in 1999. And it used to have this little bit of, it had this bit of turf around the base. And it was, oh, look at that really clever green roof. Well, it was just a lawn. So to me, there was nothing exciting about it, but it was the most sustainable retail store. Now, whether people could criticize or whatever, I don't care about that. So in 2019, on the same site, Sainsbury's was knocked down and the IKEA Greenwich has been put up there, and it was the most sustainable retail store in 2019. And just to finish this story, I say, what will be the most sustainable store in 2039? And so the point of that story is, over the 20 years of being involved in this, yes, we didn't talk about climate change in 2000. We started talking about it in 2004. It's the first time the government mentioned it. We didn't really talk about, in the built environment, really, biodiversity, natural capital, ecosystem services. We do now. The problem with it is we go to the other subject that was just surfacing around 2000 was sustainability, and particularly carbon. So, BREEAM was originally all about carbon. So, I go and sit with architects and it's all about how much carbon they could save. Green roofs don't save any carbon. We don't care about that. And why I bring that up is, even with the natural capital and the biodiversity net gain, the way that the metrics are developed are not complex enough to deal with the complexity of biodiversity, natural capital, ecosystem services. And it's just because how we do things. That's our cultural way of doing things. And in a way, we need to shift to a better approach. And that underlies everything, architecture, engineering, ecology. It's kind of still in this sort of, 19th century, very linear process.
Yeah, well, I've actually talked about something similar to that, about holism in one of my previous paper that I mentioned to you, about sort of the complex systems involved and how they sort of integrate into, I guess, the theoretical side of architecture. But I'm also interested in how they integrate into the practical side and how architecture weaves itself into the complex systems of the natural world and the natural environment and the built environment. And I suppose you're right in saying that there's such a, as I think you said before, a tick box approach to the kind of sort of green infrastructure and greenwashing, I suppose, is the terms being used around that we need a more holistic way of looking at things. But how do you think is the best way to achieve that as it relates to your area?
Well, I'm not too sure. I mean, I think what we need, my specific area, or the thing that I'm pretty well known for, is green roofs. I've helped write policy, I've written technical guidelines. But my interest in green roofs is biodiversity. I deal with everything else. And I think the only way we can change that is everybody takes it seriously and says it is the most important performance output of that thing. And I'm going to, if I may, why I brought up Bogota. So Colombia have created this guideline for green roofs. And you can actually Google it, and there's an English paper about it. And I wish all guidelines were written this way, because what it's done is, and the guy who did it, Andre Ibanez, he's a professor of architecture, and he's a very interesting man. So he looked at all the guidelines, which, let's be quite frank, the mother of all guidelines in green roofs is German. Now, this is where we get into some technical stuff yet. So our codes of practice in the Western world are based upon waterproofing first. Right, waterproofing. Is it protected from vegetation and soil? Second thing is, when this was always developing around 1984, everything changed in Germany about 1984 because they started to make policy. They said, right, okay, the waterproofing industry wasn't very, very good in 1984. There was a lot of leaks. The flat roofing industry was crap everywhere, yeah? And it was crap in Germany. I've got people I know. So the second thing was, how do we get the water off quickly, as quick as possible? And then there's soil and vegetation. Right, we don't care about that. Those two are the most important things. So our guidelines really are built in this very linear process from waterproofing up. Bogota goes, what does the city want? Now, if the city wants cooling, you go down here, you do this. If the city wants biodiversity and cooling, you go down here and you do that. If the city wants stormwater, cooling, or if it wants food growing, or if you're in a slum. So it does this. It's about performance criteria. It's framed. What do we want to achieve in this neighborhood, this building? What do we, as the city, want to gain from this green stuff? Yeah. So when you do it that way, eventually you go through all that, and then you get to what he states as the inert elements, the things that don't live, which is waterproofing, drainage boards, insulation. And so it goes down to that point. And actually what that means is they make better decisions about what the soil and vegetation is going to be. But here it's like, right, okay, is my waterproofing protected? Is my water getting off? And the soil and vegetation, fine. Oh, and the other thing is structure. Is it light enough? So there's an assumption in the world, and I'm not blaming architects and all engineers, they go, right, well, the lighter it is, the better it is. Well, if you're interested in soil and vegetation, the lighter it is, the worse it is. So again, the Bogota goes, right, if you want biodiversity, you've got to be within these parameters. So it's starting from performance function, from a climate change and biodiversity and green infrastructure perspective, not from a product basis. And that's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, I guess because in climates like ours, I suppose traditionally the ingress of water was sort of the primary problem, wasn't it? And has been for hundreds of years, and even into the 20th century when they started building flat roofs and they all leaked. And I was always told early on, you'll be really careful with green roofs because they always leak, and the flat roofs always leak, and all this kind of thing. I suppose there's still sort of a nervousness probably. And perhaps now the technology, the building systems have finally caught up, that they're reliable enough to be able to sustain even not optimally designed systems, green roof systems.
Well, I mean, first thing is to defend, obviously when I got involved in this, I had to meet a lot of people who sold green roofs who are waterproofers. And the first guy, I got three of them together, Sarnafil, Alamask and Bowder, through a guy who was with Alamask then. And Alamask, he used to say, I go into the architects and they just said, well, you're just using these green roofs to flog your waterproofing, aren't you? It was quite disdainful. So the waterproofing industry has always been, from what I've experienced, been viewed very disdainfully. The waterproofing industry in the United Kingdom is really, really up to speed. And things do leak. And that's normally down to bad workmanship, or it's down to errors of other trade. And on the errors of other trade, the most sensible thing to do is get a green roof on it as soon as it's waterproofed, because then the waterproofing is protected. It's counterintuitive. And I've just got to give you an example of a development near here. It's the largest green roof in the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and there was some leaking on it. It's got paving on it, it's got green roof. And it's happened to me 10 times. It must be the green roof's fault. So the green roof contractor's called in to remove the green roof, and he says before he moves it, I think you should remove the paving and check underneath the paving first. No, it's got to be that green roof, So 300 square metres of a lot of soil and stuff is removed. There's no leak. Where's the leak? It's under paving. And it's somebody's dropped a scaffold pole on the waterproofing before the paving went in. Now, I'm not joking. That has happened to me so many times. And I've got Mark Harris, who's chair of the Green Roof Organisation now. He used to work for Sarnafil. I remember him telling me in 2004, the leak had to be because of the green roof. No, it was on the exposed membrane. So what do? It's pragmatic is to check the exposed membrane. No, it's got to be that green roof thing. That's got to cause the leak. So it's kind of an interesting because it's counterintuitive, protect the membrane. The other thing is everybody goes, leak testing, that's a burden. You go it costs a couple of £1,000. Leak test it. That should be, that shouldn't be the waterproofer's role. It should be whoever owns that. Say, I want to check that everything's fit for purpose. So we don't really do that. We kind of we shift blame. And, if you put a good green roof system on a good waterproofing, that roof should last 60, 70, 150 years. Local authorities change their waterproofing every 20 years. I've told them, put a good green roof on there. You won't have to change that. And actually Camden started to do that about 2006. But because it's new, and everyone goes, it's not part of it.
It seems new, don't they? I always think of the old sort of Nordic and Icelandic houses, which are just, they don't have damp-proof membranes and all this kind of stuff. They just have planks of wood and large chunks of turf.
Well, they have actually birch bark underneath it. And yeah. And, obviously, that's a waterproofing layer. And, you think, well, if you're laying pieces of birch bark about this big, I mean, that's to actually get that consistent. I mean, that takes some. But, you brought that up because I'm sort of planning this sort of green roof masterclass. And, I'm going to talk about the modern development of green roofs. And, it's insightful. The modern green roof movement really grew out of ecologists in West Berlin looking at these roofs that are vegetated. They didn't have any wilderness to go to because of the Iron Curtain. And in the late 1870s, 1880s in Berlin, there was a wet bitumen waterproofing which was produced, which is highly inflammable. So to protect it from fire, they covered it in 6 centimetres of sand. They're called Mieskarten roofs. all over Berlin there were these sand roofs, And obviously there's not very many of them left now because of what happened in the Second World War. Berlin got pretty trashed. So there's one in the Grunwald on a water treatment centre, and that was built in, I think it was 1886, I remember rightly. And it vegetated. And there's a few still left in the centre of Berlin, and they vegetated. But the vegetation is different in the Grunwald than in the centre of Berlin. And the reason that is because Berlin was a city like London that used coal. So air pollution limited the species that lived on these roofs. In the Grunwald, it's out on the west, slightly in the rural part, you've got different vegetation. So when architects think about a green roof, they think sedums. Yeah. Well, sedums were quite good in Berlin at putting up with the air pollution. And once we get into that, we get into, right, what I need is a product. I need a sedum green roof. It's not saying that sedums are wrong, but it's a product. It's kind of IKEA, right? That's what I get, and that's what I get. The original green roofs in the 60s and 70s in Germany and Switzerland, it was really Switzerland, were actually all wire flats. Then regulation came in and flat roofing and getting water off. So it turned from wildflowers to sedums because of one of the technical elements that were required. They didn't used to use drainage boards prior to 1984. They were brought in when regulations were coming in. And if you go anywhere in the Alps, anywhere in hilly areas of Germany, France, standard practice to have a garden on a garage in a mountainous area because, so this culture of vegetating and using gravel as a kind of drainage element has been there for years.
I find it interesting that doesn't seem to have infiltrated the sort of British vernacular on this island, apart from perhaps up in sort of the Hebrides or up in Scotland to some degree. It seems very Nordic kind of thing. And it doesn't seem to be so much in the UK, and maybe that's why it never caught on so quickly.
Well, the turf, in that case, that's the turf roof concept. And obviously, in the Celtic areas, they did it. They do it a lot in West Wales, actually. But obviously, there may well be a vernacular tradition in England, but it might have been lost a long, long time ago. I can't believe that it's not, Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you go back even probably into early Anglo-Saxon time. Turf roofs were probably around because it's a very pragmatic thing to do, but it's got lost as you go into the clay area, and those western parts were relatively poor, I suspect, poorer. It's an interesting thing to research because I can't believe that there's not any vernacular turf roofs.
You mentioned sedum. I always perceive that sedum kind of started the main sort of green roof movement, and now it's nice to see that actually fully biodiverse roofs, with much more established plants, are actually becoming more of the norm, and people are sort of less scared, I guess, to put something that has a greater soil depth and is perhaps a bit less controllable than sedum is, because sedum can just be sort of set to the position where it is, and it doesn't grow and go crazy, and you don't have to maintain it, and people don't feel like they're going to be burdened later on with having to maintain something, I guess. So that's why it was more popular to some degree.
Well, I'm not too sure about that because, as I say, the original German green roofs prior to 1984 were mainly wildflowers, but it was the use of a drainage board that changed that. But I think the context is, and again, I don't want to sound too rude here, but a sedum blanket system is a living system, but what it looks like a product. It looks inanimate. And I think there's a culture within, whether it's through architectural training, I always say to people, look, the construction industry is based upon a brick. A brick is a consistent material that does what it does for as long as it's in a wall. That is what architecture and building is about. A living system is very hard to comprehend if you are a product-based industry.
It's not consistent and it's not predictable, is it?
Yeah. And the thing is, even when, we get into the technicals, if you're doing a lightweight system, well, it looks good when it's installed, but probably in 3 years' time, it's not going to look very good, because the focus is make it light, not how is it going to live. And that's why I keep saying I'm trying to say, if we look at what the functionality of that roof is over its 20 years, 40 years, 50 years, we need to be looking at what that vegetation is and how that vegetation can sustain itself, especially with climate change. And that's where, and it's really nice that you're saying that, the biodiversity thing in the UK is much, much more. Probably, I think I can claim a lot of credit for that, pushing the biodiversity thing. But it's still a fight, because there's this product mentality. I need a product. And to be fair to the green roof industry, their clients are not the planning authority. Their clients are the architects and the developer. The planning authority of London Borough of Lewisham, which we're in, was one of the first to really push this planning condition for biodiversity. They're still having to work really, really hard to make sure that biodiverse green roofs are delivered in Lewisham, because they get products. Just that's the mentality.
Well, I suppose it could be a hangover from, because it's part of the building. I guess there might be more of a mentality that it's, you can just spec a different kind of roof thing, rather than seeing it as an extension of the landscaping strategy done by the landscape designer or the landscape architect. It's sort of seen as separate from that, whereas actually it needs to be seen as part of the same thing. And whereas you wouldn't say, I'm going to pick that spec of garden, but you can have a landscape designer and they come in and they set out a strategy and all this kind of thing. But because it's part of the building, it might be more liable to be being seen as something that can just be specified rather than actually sort of designed properly.
Well, to be honest, once it's designed and specified, and this is part of what you said, it's out of sight, out of mind, nobody cares. Well, but if it's not delivering biodiversity as well as it could, then it hasn't delivered its function. And so that's where the problem lies, is there's no respect for it. I think it's a word of respect for it. And, it's a nightmare, because I've written most of the guidance and I've written most of the planning conditions. I have actually done it. And I've always put my hands up. I've made quite a few mistakes. The brown roof idea. People still say to me, Dusty, obviously you've never heard of a brown roof. Well, the brown roof was and you'll find it in a lot of planning conditions all over the country now. The brown roof was this idea way back in 1997. Everybody said green roofs are too expensive. We were trying to replicate brownfield habitat. So we went, you just put some crushed concrete and brick up there and let the plants come, because that's what ecologists do.
Bioreceptivity.
Yeah. So the original first brown roof, and there's kind of a segue story to the architects. I don't have to name them because I think most people know who they are, but the La Barre Dance Centre, which won a Sterling Prize, had the first brown roof on it. And it's a mile away, and I've been visiting it. I haven't been able to visit the last 2 years. So I've been visiting that since it opened in 2002. So that was the first roof that was put up, and we went, let the plants come. But in 2000, I went to Switzerland and met this guy, Dr. Stefan Van Arsen, and he said, that's wrong. If you don't put the plants in, the only plants that come are the plants you don't want on a roof. Buddleia, which is very harmful. Yeah. But we were so successful in promoting the brown roof term that, the Olympics had a target for brown roofs. And all the way up to 2012, I was going, free advice. So, you don't want a brown roof, you want a biodiverse green roof. And I still get people lecturing me about brown roofs, and I kind of roll my eyes. And eventually I said, look, I did invent the term with 3 other geezers, But that's interesting because, again, it's like, that's become embedded in a lot of processes. So Camden still have a brown or living roof planning condition. And I'm talking with Camden saying, look, you've got to change it, because a brown roof has become an excuse for whoever to put whatever they like up and nobody cares. And there's a few technical things like Greenwich, Royal Borough of Greenwich, they insist on, I just wrote a report for Greenwich. I wrote I wrote everything for them in 2011, and I didn't specify plug plants, and they said, no, it has to have plug plants. The green roofing industry hates plug plants. These are little plugs you plant into the soil. A, it takes a long time, and B, the birds just steal them. Now, it's a good idea if you're me, I get something happening straight away rather than waiting for the seeds to come up. It's just a dumb idea. No. You have to have, I was looking at something from Camden again yesterday, 12 to 15 species of plugs planted. And I'm going, oh yeah, I wrote that about 2008. And I want to go to all the birds, like, can we just take that out? Because it's a waste of money. It's not, yeah. But it's funny when you do these things and then you learn, and it's very difficult to change things.
Yeah. Well,
excuse me.
Down to what level of node you want to give a particular space, particular green space, isn't it? Because you could have a sort of purely bioreceptive philosophy where you're just going to create an environment that whatever is in the immediate ecosystem can move into. But then you're going to limit, depending on the building, I suppose, you're going to limit what's actually going to be able to access that particular space. So not all species are going to be able to sort of drop their seeds or have their seeds fall in onto the right space. So how much do you want to say, oh, we're going to decide what's going to go here, and we're going to plant it and it will grow, and yes, some other stuff will come in probably. The primary stuff will be what we put in from day one. Yeah. Versus, so I guess it's sort of a more romantic idea to say, oh, we're just going to let nature come in and do what it needs to do, but that practically that doesn't really work very well. No, it doesn't. And ecologists, some ecologists, or people who it's not nature conservationists. Like, oh, there's a brownfield site. We just let nature colonise it, and you go, yeah, it's going to be colonised in Budleigh. Yeah, it's going to be colonised in Budleigh. Oh yeah. Budleigh is everywhere in London. Yeah, I mean, I've got to do this. It's a bugbear of mine. There's down in Deptford, beautiful wildflower meadow area created, part of planning condition, and the landscape architects go and plant Budleigh, and you just go, why? It's now taking over the wildflower area. Yeah, anybody who knows their salt in the nature world would go, it's a pernicious weed. There was a guy in the 70s who made it really famous as the butterfly bush. No, it's the caterpillar killer because it kills all the food plants. Yeah. Flowers, and it looks like it's sort of nicer than a sort of scrub grassland or something like that. Well, go and look at it when it's not in flower. It's one of the ugliest things in the world. I mean, it really is ugly. Yeah, but so what we can do, it's like taking that romantic idea, and it still pervades sort of my sector, is what we need to do when we build a roof where it's very clear to me it's an artificial habitat. We are creating this. Now, what we have to do with that, if it's specifically for biodiversity, is say, how can we create that in an appropriate way to the ecoregion that ensures that we don't get pernicious weeds in like Budleigh, gets the right sort of plant community there, which is right for the invertebrate community, which is then, all the way up the chain, but also allows things to come that we don't know what's going to come. So it's been in the press all the last couple of months at Namura, the last month or so. Namura, which is this bank, and I wouldn't mind segueing back to Namura actually at some point. There's a guy who goes up there, who's very, very knowledgeable, finds this smooth flowered tongue orchid. It's only been found in the United Kingdom once. It was in Cornwall about 10, 15 years ago and was gone. The nearest place you find it is southern France, Iberia. How the hell did it get here? Well, I'm pretty sure it's some kind of freak wave, heat waves, but it's there. Now, the fact that roof's there has allowed it to turn up. That's a fantastic story. The BBC want to get up there, blah, blah, blah. Whether it stays there forever, who knows, But because that roof, has somebody who's observing it all the time, and it's a solar green roof, but also what Namura have done, and they're working with a charity, and I like to celebrate them. And this is what I think we need more of, is as a big company, they're engaging with the local community, who are a gardening community, that been helping
improve the biodiversity of this green roof because it was pretty boring green roof. And in doing that, this thing has turned up and quite a few interesting bees, actually. But they're using the green roof with the charity to get young people to come to the bank, and then they're getting them to go and meet the accountants, the investors, and then some of them hopefully will get jobs in New Mirror. And you go like, we're using this green roof as a tool on a multi-level. So that green roof has got respect. They're respecting it. Half the time, nobody gives a damn. Yeah. Spec it, throw it up, and who cares?
Well, yeah, I guess this comes down to education and accessibility on a practical level, doesn't it?
Yeah.
One of the things that particularly annoys me is the lack of scientific engagement in architectural education or scientific knowledge. And I think, especially these days, biology is probably the primary relevant science, particularly structural engineers, you don't know much about physics. But I think every architectural education course should include a significant amount of biology and ecology and knowledge of actually what plants are what and where they go and what kind of things suit what environments, even if not on a massively technical level.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did this thing for Reba the other night. I brought this up at the end. I read this with joy. I can't remember how I got hold of it. The Victoria University in British Columbia on Victoria Island, the engineering department says it is mandatory you take a two-month course on biodiversity. And I just went, engineers learning about biodiversity. And so the head of this department saying, no, we are people who design things. Our job is to design, civil engineers' job is to design roads, is to design pipework, blah, blah, blah. And that has an impact on biodiversity. So we as engineers need to understand it. Doesn't mean that they become like fully qualified, biodiversity nuts like me, but they understand the implication. And obviously within civil engineering now, when you look at the SUDS train and, how you manage stormwater through the environment, that is a way to create artificial natural spaces. And I'm going to call them artificial because they're man-made,
But most spaces around, so-called natural spaces in this country are man-made. Like our sort of countryside and most of our national parks are all effectively man-made landscapes.
Yeah, that's why. We could have a whole historical. There's nothing in the United Kingdom that hasn't actually been managed by human beings. Yeah. Maybe the Cairngorms, but even the Cairngorms has been impacted on by human beings. But when I say man-made, artificial, I'm kind of talking about the built environment to make that differentiation, because my community, like the nature nuts, want it all to be natural. And you go, hang on a minute, what we can do here, because we are, managing this process, we can take strategic decisions that can have a positive impact. So when I first started doing all the green roofs, for all these brownfield sites, I had people up in Birmingham going, oh, you're selling out to the developers. I'm going, look, they're going to develop. What I'm trying to do is get something happening on those buildings that is positive. So if you go to the Greenwich Peninsula now, Greenwich Peninsula in 1997, because I did a survey of it, was just one great big wasteland. Fantastic wildlife on it, There is now only about 2 or 3 small pockets of brownfield land on the peninsula. Nearly 70% of the buildings have green roofs for biodiversity. To me, that's a really important story. Cities are about regeneration.
Yeah, I think maybe we can get into this now to segue to that, is that I imagine on the other builds, most of the buildings going up a high story or fairly multi-story buildings. Yeah. Certainly in the north end, and very, very tall buildings. How effective in terms of actually creating a contiguous ecosystem is it in having green roof, even if it's the entirety of a block that's, 30 meters by 30 meters on a tower? If that space at the top of that tower is a green roof, and a very good green roof, and even if that's the case on every single one of those towers in the area, how effective are those in creating a contiguous and effective ecosystem in that area if they're so separate from each other?
Well, we have to deal with 2 issues there. First of all, there's ecological networking, which is the hedgehog principle, that the hedgehog can go everywhere. Well, that's not going to happen. Yeah, that's not going to happen on a roof. But I found a new way to explain this. When I first went to Switzerland to meet this Bernice and I, Dr. Bernice and I, went off to a place to find a special bird, actually, a wall creeper for anybody who's a bird watcher. So I ended up in the R Gorge, and the R is a river. And this gorge is a really narrow gorge. It's about as wide as this room, yeah? And I remember watching a blackbird taking a drink in the River R, then flying 450 metres up to the top of the gorge. Now, why that's relevant is a tall building is a problem for a human being. So when I got a green roof put up on Barclays HQ, which is One Churchill Place over in that area, the Canary Wharf area, people used to say to me, "Oh, Dusty, how are the bees going to get up there?" I said, "They're going to take the lift." And for a moment, but the great thing about it, for a moment, people believed me for that fraction of a second. I said, they're going to fly. And then I've still got bee experts saying to me, "Oh, it'll be too windy up there." Oh, and you go like, right, look, it's 180 meters high. Now, if you're on a road and there was a wildflower area 180 meters away at ground level, nobody would consider that a problem. So by the time you've done the hypotenuse, yeah, it's 220 meters, yeah, if you flew in a diagonal, yeah, for a bee. 220 meters is nothing. And Canary Wharf is lower than where I'm sitting now. You know, we are higher than all the buildings at Canary Wharf. What we do is we look at Canary Wharf and go, that's a massive problem for wildlife. And you go, look, if you put a green roof on every single one of those buildings at 12 story, 17 story, 32 story, 24 story, you will have a habitat, but that habitat will be different. So when you go to the Table Mountain in Venezuela, which is quite famous, David Attenborough went up there, you know, it's this Table Mountain. Up there, they've got really, really interesting stuff that you don't find anywhere else in the world. And if you go to Utah and go on top of the Table Mountains there is vegetation and soil there, which is actually similar to ground level. Terrestrial beasts can't get up there. So it won't be a complete ecosystem. But if it's a functioning ecosystem, and also it's doing all the other things, cooling, stormwater, blah, 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 that is good ecosystem services. So I've been asked to talk about how things might be creating an ecological network in one neighbourhood in London, all these green roofs. I said, I'm not going to talk about it. We're using a ground-based ecological term for something that cannot be done at roof level.
Yeah. On the tall buildings, how much does wind come into it? You must have to select the right plants to go on the right buildings. Like one of the ones I wanted to ask you about was the towers in Milan with the trees on every service.
Yeah.
And the appropriateness or otherwise of that. And maybe we can tie in, go from the sort of effect of wind on plant and ecosystem selection on one of the Isle Dogs towers. What is the sort of answer to that question, and then how does that tie in further to putting trees on space with them?
All right, so I'll go from Canary Wharf to the Bosco Verticale. Yeah. No, because I've been to the Bosco and I know the tree person very well. Laura Gassi is a very good friend of mine. First of all, before the green roof was installed on One Churchill Place, everybody went wind. We had all these wind consultants, all this, and I was going like, it's counterintuitive. The assumption is, so we had to have all this erosion stuff and all this technical stuff, and the green roof was installed, and we stood up there, and we went, it's windier downstairs than it is windier here. And I used to go and sit up there nearly 3 or 4 times a week, and you'd be, leaning into the wind down in, basically Chicago, Windy City, Canary Wharf, and you'd be up on the roof and you'd be going, it's not as windy. So carrying on that, we was involved in a development elsewhere in Tower Hamlets where there's this quite uncommon butterfly called a small blue. And people not from the developer, were going, well, this small blue, no, it's too windy on roofs for small blue. So I contacted a friend of mine, Dr. Dan Danaher, who does the biosphere down in Brighton, and he builds these chalk banks for butterflies. So I said, Dan, right, okay, this is the issue. I said, right, have you built a chalk bank on the top of the South Downs and do the butterflies come? He said, Dusty, I put one on top of Varndine. If a southwesterly gale is blowing in there, it'd be worse than on a roof in Canary Wharf. Yeah, they come. Again, we don't worry about thinking about the South Downs and the small blue butterfly. What we do worry about is when we see a building, and it's what we do is we perceive our problem and perceive that nature's going to have the same problem.
Yeah, because I suppose we would say, I suppose the obvious counter argument is, oh, well, that's part of a contiguous landscape, but it feeds off, yes, it's high elevation, but it feeds off into a rolling countryside on one side.
Yeah.
Whereas the green roof is sort of isolated on its building. Therefore, one has easy access to wildlife and the other one doesn't. But if that's not relevant for flying creatures, then it's sort of, as I say, it's a perceptual problem on our part, isn't it?
Yeah. See, so the hedgehog principle doesn't work at roof level, quite obviously. But he also said the small blue, if you put something up 6 to 10 miles away, they will find it. Now, obviously, the reason they find it is they are very, very sensitive to the smell of its food plant. So if you've got a food plant on top of a building, in Tower Hamlets, and they're nearby, they will get there. And so what we, to tie that up and then get to the Bosco, the whole principle of what we've been trying to do is put the right habitat in, get the right plants in, and let nature come. And what nature comes is good. If you don't put the right plants in and you get the wrong nature, i.e. the weeds, then you've got problems. Now, going to the Bosco, is a very interesting project because, it looks stunning. Let's be quite frank. I don't tend not to do architecture. I don't look at outsides of buildings because I haven't seen a recent picture of it, so I don't know how it's developed since I went there 2019 and Laura said, yeah, it's looking good. They've changed some of the trees. So what they did, it's far more sophisticated than comes across because everybody sees it. There's different tree species and different aspects and at different heights. And it's irrigated. And it is irrigated. The most interesting thing, just from in a way, an architectural real estate perspective, people own the flats. They do not own the balconies. Oh, really? The balconies are owned by the developer. And there's a very good reason for that, because they get maintained by one maintenance crew. And that was a strategic decision at the start. You don't rent your balcony, you buy your flat and you have access to your balcony. But you cannot change that. Yeah. So when I went, Laura was saying to me, people sit, so in Milan in the winter, the top so many floors, they can get actually quite cold. So the tree species are specific trees that actually help with that winter insulation. But also in the summer, the top floors tend to be a lot hotter, if it was a standard, skyscraper. So again, the tree species, I think on the south side are slightly different from the north side. And if I remember rightly, Laura said, well, we actually, in some of the areas, and it's sort of the boundary zones, like between the 10th and the 7th floor, hypothetically, I can't remember. In the boundary zones, because lower down, there's a different temperature control that the trees are doing. They did actually get some of the tree species slightly wrong. So I think it was about 3 years in, they started to change some of the tree species. So they craned them out and moved them to the west facing or the east facing. And they're constantly being monitored to see the temperatures being constantly monitored on all floors, because it was designed to have impact on each floor in a different way, or groups of floors, if I remember rightly. So when people see it, they think, oh, it's a bunch of trees. Isn't that great? You go, yeah, but it's a bunch of trees which each one is doing a function in the location it's in. That is what I call, complex ecological design. Complex doesn't mean it's complicated. Complicated is a problem. Complexity is good. But what people do is when you're at that level of sophistication, people say, oh, that's too complicated. You go, no, it's complex. But if you do that, you will make really very good living spaces for people. As you said to the residents, right, okay, let's be quite frank, they're all millionaires, yeah? That they, from the perception of the residents, now, Laura's involved in it, but I think I take it as face value, is it's been highly successful. They get people saying, we watching birds nest and blah, 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 and you can see that and you feel sort of, it's not a garden, you feel like you're connected to a bit of wilderness because it is quite, it's not really very formal. It does feel like you're in, obviously it's only one row of trees, but you kind of feel like it's semi-natural. And, when I was there were, if people who know birds, there were blackcaps singing at every single bloody level. This is a warbler. You can that's just great because you've got bird habitat on the vertical, I
think from a biodiversity point of view, that sort of thing is really good. The other obvious criticism that you can ask is the sort of embodied carbon.
Yeah.
Because the amount of energy it takes to pump the water up constantly to irrigate it, plus the cost of the carbon, additional embodied carbon and the additional concrete to support the amount of weight of all those trees. Do you know if that calculation has actually been done?
I don't know whether that calculation has been done, but first of all, I know that all the water is pumped by solar panels which are on the roof. Nobody ever sees the solar panels on the roof, but there's actually solar panels on the roof. But again, if you were carbon, and I'm going to call it carbon fixated, you could say, well, actually, that's not good. But it's not just about carbon. It's about all that temperature balancing. It's about the water storage in the winter. It's about the biodiversity. It's about the human comfort and human experience. So one of the problems with just carbon counting is we miss all the other environmental processes. And, they're designing about 20 now in China and there's a few going up in Switzerland. And I think they're looking at how they design those balconies so that they can reduce it,
Because it seems like the obvious benefit of that way of doing things is it's sort of, you're taking rather than the surface area of the building footprint and replacing that at ground level, at roof level with an ecosystem of some kind. You've massively increased the potential surface area by building a tall tower. And why not, therefore, take maximum advantage of that and use all of the surface area through green walls in some way? And I would count that as effectively a green wall.
Yeah, let's call it a green wall. Yeah.
Then you get that continuity of ecosystem if that's valuable to any species at all. I don't know whether it actually would make a difference or not. But you also get as you said, the solar and the cooling side, the heating side, and the aesthetic value.
Yeah.
Of rather than so imagine every tower in the Isle of Dogs was like that instead of being glass or fake brick or whatever it is.
Yeah,
that would be hugely psychologically beneficial to everyone who lived there.
Yeah,
they'd be looking at effectively a forest rather than large glass towers.
Yeah, and also, for me, as using birds, but then there's all the bees and everything else. Is if all the towers at Canary Wharf were done in a way like the Bosco is with the appropriate trees for this area, you'd have Oxley's Wood in Canary Wharf because the area. If you took all those towers and laid them flat, that would be like nearly. I bet you it's the size of the whole of the Isle of Dogs. That's a woodland the size of the Isle of Dogs. If you take that view, now it would be what we would probably call a semi-natural woodland because it's not a natural woodland. But you go. Nearly everything that you'd find at ground level in a semi-natural woodland is potentially could be found in that. Now, nature conservationists will go, oh, that can't be right because it's buildings, because we ourselves get blocked. It's a built environment. No, that can't happen. So when I put the green roofs first up, people say to me, no, nothing to go there. And you go like, well, there's all this stuff. If you sometimes we want to be God because we've done all our studies and everything like that. I go, look, I'm really somebody who just wants to promote nature. So my belief is put it in, let it come. Put it in as well as you can, but there's still this thing, it's a lost Eden. We've got to go back to the lost Eden. I'm not interested in Eden. I'm not interested in what nature was like 500 years ago. I don't care. I want to know what nature's going to be like in 100 years' time.
Yeah. Well, let's segue to green walls.
Okay, yeah.
My perception of green walls at the moment, obviously they're gaining in popularity, which is good. As far as I can tell, almost all of them seem to be irrigated.
Yeah.
Not always successfully.
Yeah.
They're often just very small patches of area on buildings. And they, as far as I can tell, they almost never include climbing plants. And this seems very odd to me, considering green walls have existed for hundreds of years in the forms of ivies and creepers and that kind of thing. What's your perception of the current status of green walls and what needs to change to make them progress better?
Well, I mean, historically, green roofs first for me, green walls, yeah. The trouble with green walls is, first of all, again, it's perceptual quality. It's all about horticultural bling. Now, I'm not so pro green walls, primarily because the market is driven from a horticultural bling point of view. That's my problem with it. So the green walling companies will all be going, wanting to say horrible things to me, But, my interest is what I can deliver to the city, which is sustainable. So the two green walls that I have been directly involved with through certain processes in London, Rubens at the Palace, which my colleague Gary Grant designed, identified the wall, he designed it. It was clear we're going to make that a sustainable urban drainage system. That is irrigated not by potable water. It is irrigated by water that is collected from the roofs.
Is it just gravity fed, or is it?
Yeah, and gravity fed, yeah. Well, there's some pumping to get to the top, yeah. So there's a cistern at, I think it's floor 3, which collects all the rainwater, and then it's pushed around it, yeah. And that will be coming from a non-renewable source, I suspect, yeah. I can't remember technically. The only time they've had to use potable water was in the drought of 2019, which was the worst drought we've ever had. The other wall, which is the Fair Street green wall near the Mayor's office in London, is again, it's a social housing, it used to be Southwark housing, and there's all these pitched roofs which are above it, and they all drain into a panel at the rear that irrigate that wall. The only time it's never used rainwater was in 2019, and it did die because it was assumed. Yeah, it was a terrible drought, to be quite frank. So from my perspective, if a green wall is going up and it's not connected to the sustainable urban drainage system, it's horticultural bling. Now, I know even my colleague Gary might find I just go like, it's just not right. I can only know of 2 others that are vertical rain gardens. There's 2 I know now. There's one in Portland, and I think there's now one in Seattle. My view is, if they are not vertical rain gardens, I'm not too sure what it's about.
By vertical rain garden, you mean purely fed by the rainwater?
Yeah.
And would that include potentially irrigating during extremely hot summers?
Yeah, well, you'd always, just as a matter of course, you will have to have a connection to a potable source in case of a extreme heat wave. Now, I know there's a lot of work going on in the northwest of the States on looking at how they can essentially be vertical rain gardens, because there's a lot more SUDS legislation in the United States of America at city level because of polluted rivers. To me, that's where it needs to go. But, I'm going to segue back to roofs, because that issue is the same. What happens when we as I understand it, you tell me wrong because you're an architect, like, right, before I even get to the roof, everybody decided where the water's going. That is decided at a very early stage. The most frustrating thing for somebody who is trying to deliver green infrastructure is, I want to decide where the water goes. Now, earlier in the year, I did this thing for Camden. I went up to this 1960s tower block, which got a raised podium, and underneath it's a car park, yeah? And it's really got me thinking about this because, they got some funding maybe to turn it into, a park, And so I just created all these rain gardens on top of it. And I said, look, if I could design this block now, I would put all the drainage outlets in completely different places. So when I get given a green roof by an architect specified for biodiversity, I'm going like, if I could decide where the outlets were, I can make a really good green roof. But actually, the green roof is just dressing. So what we should be saying is vegetation on buildings in cities its primary function is storing water and then biodiversity. And how does that affect the amount of downpipes we need inside the bloody building? That's already decided for by people who are far cleverer than me. And it frustrates me because I go, if I had that water, I could decide how that water moves across the roof, where it could be stored on the roof, and where it leaves the roof and goes to the next floor, does something on that floor, goes to the next floor, does something on that floor, goes to the ground and does something at ground level. No, straight down, off you go, done deal. That is where we're not doing that. I would call that complexity. Nobody wants to do that. No, you always put it down. We've got 4 outlets on the roof, 4 downpipes, off it goes to the sewage system. That is decided probably right at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I also that's about early engagement of relevant consultants in the project, isn't it? And to give the RIBA some credit, they've changed the plan of work recently to bring more sustainability earlier on into the plan of work, which is good. But it's good if people act on it. But if you just ignore it and still don't employ your consultants until stage 4, you're like, it's not going to help. Because, as you say, all those decisions have already been made. So, I think that sort of takes a bit of agency on behalf of architects.
No, I mean, if I'm not going to be up to speed on what REBA does because I'm not really up to speed on what it does. But if they're doing that, it's great, and I'm not looking for it. But I'd say to any architect, if you've got a really complex development, get somebody like me. Even before you get any of the drainage people in, so we can have a conversation. Plumbing with plants is the future. Is a way to put a little badge on that.
Do you think it would be possible to have, let's say, every single wall surface and every single roof surface populated with vegetation, purely fed by rain gardens, and only ever by rain, and only ever topped up in the worst summers without it dying?
Yeah. Yes and no, because it depends what that vegetation is. And, how much water can be generated. So if you've got a roof covered with, a good biodiversity green roof, you're only going to get about 50% of the rainwater that could leave that roof, yeah? So, there's going to be caveats there. But there's potentially that you could irrigate a good proportion of it, but you probably might need some. But then you go, right, okay, where's all the condenser water going? Now, people look at me with, go like, what do you mean? I said, like, air conditioning fans produce a huge amount of water. I said, oh, do they? I said, yeah, I know this because I once went onto a roof in Istanbul in August and it was green down the middle, and we realised that the guy said, well, somebody's just come to mend the air conditioning units on the roof and hasn't reconnected the pipe. So you're going, right, okay, there's a lot of water we waste inside a building.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of the upside of climate change. If we start having to install air conditioning everywhere, which I suppose already exists on all of the large tower blocks, because suddenly everybody needs an air conditioning unit on their house because it gets to 40 degrees in the summers. then there's going to be a lot of water spewing out.
Yeah, well, I just asked to do a quick sketch design for a school in Ealing that's having a new block, and I'm not blaming anyone, but just think about this to you people, to architects. So what happened here is it's been designed by some architects at Ealing Council, and fair enough, they're just doing a kind of thing, whatever. So the way it is, it's east-west. They've got the chillers on the west side, they've got the roof light in the middle, and then they've got the solar panels on the west side, right? That's all fine, yeah? But I've changed it because I've put the chillers at the north side. Now, there's a really good reason why I've done that. Because every time I go and I say to a facilities manager, I said, well, actually, technically, a green roof produces cool air. And they say, all right, okay, I want cool air going into my air conditioning fans. Because if cool air goes into my air conditioning fans, they don't work as hard, which means I have to replace them so often. Now, our prevailing winds, all right, this year's been unique because we've had easterly winds. Our prevailing winds are from the southwest. So chillers on a green roof should always be in the northeast corner. Never happens because nobody's, again, the green roof, because the green roof is just for that nature stuff. So again, what I'm trying to do with UCL is to look at some research about how vegetation on a roof or even at ground level affects the performance of an air conditioning unit. And people are saying to me, already they're saying to me, oh, well, that's not actually that interesting. I go like, it's significantly, like even if it only does it by a 20% or 5%. Every little bit counts when we're fighting climate change.
Yeah, no, definitely. In terms of retrofitting, I know you work a lot on lots of different kinds of buildings, especially large buildings.
Yeah.
If you're talking about your standard 2-3 bedroom house, 2 stories, pitch roof, and say you're a person who owns a house like that, and you want to retrofit your house with a green roof, but it's got standard roof structure, it's got standard slate tiles, and I don't know, you're in a conservation area and you can't change everything massively. How do you, maybe not the last point, but it's just practically in terms of you've got a standard house with standard roof, standard roof construction, how do you go about persuading everyone? Well, practically, how would you do it? And also, how do you go about persuading everyone who owns houses like this across the country to do that sort of thing? And practically, how do you do it? You have to replace the whole roof structure.
I suspect, having done a bit of tiling in my life, because I have done some tiling in my life, Kent peg tiles when I was a teenager, the roof rafters would have to be significantly upgraded. You'd need to plywood board it because you need your bracing, and then you need it waterproofed. In Germany, they used to use this really interesting system. They don't use it very often now. It's kind of like a whole bunch of straw, which has turned into this kind of long thing, and then they plant a blanket on top of it, and then you just throw it over the pitch. They used to do this. I don't think they do it so much now, and it did work quite well. And you occasionally see them especially in Bad Württemberg. But there's a new Dutch tile that's come out, which I'm not convinced about. I mean, it's been all over LinkedIn. It's like a little type of thing, yeah. If I was really honest, I'm not interested in pitched roofs. They're generally in parts of the town where are relatively peri-urban. It's very, very few areas of central cities where there's a lot of pitched roofs. And I'm more interested in the flat roofs in the middle of cities or in the middle of town centres,
Yeah. What about the halfway house, I suppose, of like in Georgian London, where you've got parapets, small pitch roofs, maybe small areas of flat roof, but predominantly likely fairly steep but short pitch roofs.
Yeah.
How do you go about expanding your green roofs across Kensington and Chelsea and all of the dense Georgian Victorian?
Yeah. Well, again, some of those Georgian, I spend a lot of time looking at roofs on Google, so I do kind of know. Some of those Georgian structures have like a metre and a half around the pitch, which will be there. You just go, you just go, well, just green up your metre and a half, I'm not sure. I go like, well, if you're in Chelsea and Kensington, they've got such a rich array of gardens and green space that, is the money better used elsewhere to do in North Kensington, maybe in the Royal Borough of Chelsea and Kensington? You've got North Kensington, there's a lot of social housing out there, it's got a lot of flat roofs. That's where you put your money, because that's where you're going to have the biggest impact. From a climate perspective, a sustainable urban drainage perspective, and a biodiversity perspective, greening up North Kensington is more appropriate than greening up Earl's Court, Chelsea itself, because there's a rich array of gardens there.
Yeah, I suppose as you get more suburban, I suppose the percentage of the sort of overall land surface or surface from a plant perspective that's covered by roofs decreases, there becomes less worth doing from a drainage perspective, at least. I suppose from an aesthetic perspective and a heating perspective, you just have to front the cost of replacing a roof.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest thing to do, whether you could do that in a conservation zone in Chelsea, is, take the pitch off, make it flat and green it.
Well, this is why I'm sort of trying to promote climbing plants a bit more.
Oh, we didn't talk about climbing plants. I'll go back to climbing plants.
Yeah, because it seems to me that sort of, it solves the irrigation problem because they're in the ground. So, and if they're able to survive in the ground in England and climb up whatever tree in an African environment is, they're going to be able to survive as they have in many places, putting up walls and wherever. And they require almost no installation cost at all, basically.
Well, okay. Well, give me your next point. I'll see. I don't.
I suppose the downsides are they're slow, and that you have to either you have to buy one that's already very established, or you have to wait.
Yeah. So, first of all, I don't. We got segued away from green walls. I don't actually have a problem with these modular green walls which don't have climbing plants. The trouble is, most of the time they're putting in a lot of non-native, and they claim that they can't put native in. Well, that's nonsense. It's just easy. The trouble is with the modular as well, they're very, very expensive. But the thing is, they give you this instant bling. With the climbing plants, again, at this school that I've been asked to give some advice on, the idea they've got a very, very large west-facing wall, and they're going to put climbing plants up there. And I said, yeah, it's a good idea. Again, what you will do is we will get the downpipe to go into a rain garden, which the climbing plants will be in, because that's what you want. And they want them all along the fence at the front. And I go, we will take all the water from the roofs, make metal gullies across the car park. Cars can go across it, and we will feed that water into essentially a rain or a soak place, But also, when you have a west-facing wall with a flat roof on top, there are plants that grow downwards. So you have plants that grow downwards and you have plants that grow upwards. Now, it'll probably take 5 years to get complete coverage, but that's a good idea. Now, there is actually a big shopping centre in Basel, I know, called Stucki. You can Google it, yeah? And the side, they've done that. So you've got this staircase that runs up the fire escape, yeah? And it's got plants growing down and plants growing up.
Oh, I get which one you mean. Yeah, they did it at the Serpentine Pavilion.
Maybe they did that too, yeah. I mean, but that's 7 or 8 stories, so it's quite tall, Yeah.
Well, I'm massively in favour of hanging plants like that.
Yeah.
So they grow downwards.
Yeah.
The thing that's always bothered me, I don't know if there's a way around this, am I right in saying that the reason why lots of green roofs have areas of gravel around the outside is because of the fire building regulations, that you need the space between where the firewood...
It's 500 millimetres.
And the start of
Yeah.
Is there a way to, and obviously if you had a hanging plant that was designed to hang over the side, that would not be applicable. Is there a way around
that? Yes, there is a way around that. And I would go, my instincts on that is, because what you'd have to do with those climbing plants and what they did at Stucki is right. So you'd have to have your 500mm shingle perimeter, which the Swiss would go, don't need it, yeah. You would have to have relatively deep substrate there for those climbing plants that go down. and you'd probably have some kind of wire structure that takes them to the wall so they can't grow across the shingle. The shingle is originally, and it's in the fire the document that we worked with the Department for Communities and Local Government back in 2013. As again, I don't necessarily agree with everything in the code, yeah, but what that 500 mil is to essentially make the green roof separate from the building because of fire. And there's a lot going on at the moment, and you know why, and therefore we have to respect those processes. But there is a way around that. Or you put the plants that are going to go down into some kind of planter, and then you have the 500 mil shingle perimeter on the side of the planter. But then you've got to get the water to be able to get into the planter. But that's plumbing. And plumbing is very, very important, because I said to you, plumbing with plants is, if we consider everything that goes in on a building is about plumbing, and we can connect all the plumbing, it's really, really quite simple, because plumbing is actually, a master trade. But when you just know where the water's going and you can get the water where it needs to go, fine. So plumbing with plants.
So you'd hang the hanging plants effectively on the top of the wall.
No, you could have a parapet, then the planter.
And that would be okay in terms of...
If you've got the 500 mil shingle perimeter between a planter, a plastic planter box or a wood planter box, and the green roof, that would still be compliant, I think.
You can't have it contiguous.
I don't think so, because of the fire regulator. Now, I don't always agree with the code.
Well, that's the obvious barrier to the sort of Swiss wildflower roof model, which I think is so fantastic, where you have wildflower roofs right up to the edge and overflowing the edge, which is brilliant. And there's what I think is a silly fire rate rule. You could mitigate that in other ways, probably.
Well, because I'm a Grow board member, so I have to be careful what I say. With the code says you have to have 500 million, you have to have it. As I say, I don't always agree, which is probably implying that I've.
Yeah. But also, aesthetically, I think it looks terrible. So it looks like rather than having your biodiverse areas and as part of the architecture, it looks like you've plonked this thing in the middle and it's sort of all neatly framed and it has this nice neat bit around the edge, and you're like, oh yeah, you can't have any plants intruding into a nice neat shingle border, and it doesn't have that sort of proper.
Well, it gets even worse than that, mate. Then we're going to have a nice aluminium bit of trim to make sure that the line is perfect. You go like, the Swiss would go, why are you wasting money on aluminium trim? It doesn't matter, Yeah. But then you go like, oh God, somebody makes aluminium trim, and I'll get told off for that one as well. But you just go, it's nuts. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I get what you're saying, but there are some compliances that you go, right, okay, I'll grin and bear it because I'll grin and bear it. But what it also says is, every I can't remember the exact meterage. I think it's about every 10 meters. If you've got a very, very big roof, every 10 minutes you should have a fire break across. Yeah. But again, I want to plumb with plants. So when we design small scale green roofs where we can do what we want to do, is, I don't particularly like drainage boards. Sorry. Okay. So if you've got a completely flat roof, you can do this 1 meter or 500 mil shingle as a dry riverbed, and it can meander through the roof to the outlet. And we've done this, and they actually work really, really well from a visual point of view, because what happens when you get a brown off, if you do get a brown off, you're not looking at an Indian cricket pitch. You're looking at a series of mounds with these dry riverbeds in. And also there are plants which can grow in these dry riverbeds. And it creates a kind of landscape. But what do we do? Biodiverse green roofs, right, lay it all the same, blah, blah, blah. And I keep saying to people, let's be a bit creative here. The trouble is often when I get these plans that I have to look at, and the landscape architects have been over creative, because, there are extensive green roof substrate, you got shingle, you got some logs, and you got some sand mounds. Right, what we want to do is have some of the shingle, do whatever blah, 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 And if you're looking over a roof like that, that is really interesting. It gives it structure. Now, if it's they might do all these during the Olympics. Everything was stripes. Everybody had to do stripes. That was what was vogue during the Olympics. My mate Gary worked on it. He said, "Oh, stripes again today. We're doing biodiversity by stripes." Because that was the geometry of the day. But you can. I've always said to designers, these are the things you can do. Make interesting, organic-looking landscapes. You look at some of those photographs from the satellites of how rivers and deltas move. You can they look great. Yeah. There's an organicness there, and I think we can be far more interesting about how we design biodiverse green roofs. And the other thing, while I'm on it, because I think this is really important, it's completely off topic. One of the things over the last 4 years I've been really, really getting angry about, and I've never written any guidance that said anything, but biodiverse green roofs are only for biodiversity. Well, the planners say, no, nobody's allowed on those roofs, they're for biodiversity. And I'm going, hang on a minute, this is just nuts. If you want to, in Kidbrook Village, can't you go up the stairs, there's some paving there, can't you sit on a deck chair and just look at it? And if we could look at it, we might take better care of it. Yeah. So there's these thousands of square metres of roofs across. There's 2.5 million. So let's say there's 1.8 million square metres of green roofs that probably are for biodiversity. There's 1.8 million square metres of which people could sit by. We don't mind them walking on Blackheath, which is, a very, very important nature conservation site in London. But to go on a roof, no. They might upset the nature. You're going, give us a break. Because they're only going to go there up in the morning or in,
we always see in concept renderings and competition renderings, you see someone photoshopping a horse and a picnicking family on top of the roof, amongst the meadow and things, a deer poking its head through the window or something like that. In reality, you see the building and there's a little wire fence that says walk on the roof or things like this, or they have you walk on the roof and they put a metre-high railing around the edge because they have to, because they technically you can go on the roof or something like that.
Yeah, you have to do all that compliance stuff, but what worries me then is because there's a lot of these in Berlin actually on social housing, actually in the East Berlin, which they've retrofitted after the wall came down. They have a little metal, chain fence, and there's this little regulation that says, right, first of all, no dogs on the green roof. And there's a big sign of poo, right? And so then it says you can sunbathe on the green roof, but sunbathe in a different place every day. Right, because then you don't have a negative impact on the meadow, This is just a standard green roof with wildflowers. As soon as people are accessible to a green roof, it's got to be high-end landscape. You go, why can't they just sit and look at a meadow? Yeah. And it's this cultural thing. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm quite open. If there's a paved area and there's a barbecue unit, there's some benches, and a mother with her child wants to go and sit out there and look over the skyline and see all this wildlife, paving. That's kind of cool. I don't mind, but can she sit by the wild meadow? Or if she can do that, let's have our bamboo and and all this, high-end landscape. No. People should just be able to look at meadows. We don't need to do all that. But, the culture is as soon as it's accessible visually or physically, it's got to be heavily designed. And you go formalised, yeah.
That just comes into the general tendency of people to want to neaten things up all the time, rather than, which is understandable, rather than having the sort of wild, the messiness of nature effectively growing up.
Yeah, but that's the problem, because that's what we do in cities. But when I do these tours to these biodiverse green roofs in normal years, there's one on 202 Bishopsgate. And the last time I did the tour in 2019, 5 of the people have worked in that office for 15 years and never been on that roof. And they all said to me, we would love to just come and sit here and have our sandwiches. Yeah. It looks like Dungeness. Now, Dungeness is all right in Dungeness, but Dungeness on a roof, as soon as people go, no, you can't have that, because it's not modern or it's not neat. You go let people encounter nature. Mm. And it's a big bugbear for me, because there's thousands of square metres of roofs which people could just sit by.
Well, this is partly why I like green walls, because you can't access it.
Yeah.
The most you can do is trim around the windows if something's growing too much. It's not, you don't have the opportunity to mess it up. in a sort of overly formalising way, in the way that humans like to. And that's why you get, like in Vancouver, there's a hotel that's completely covered in Virginia creeper.
Yeah, that's right,
It's an absolutely beautiful building. And that's probably only like 2 or 3 plants, or something that are just really old. And that sort of strikes me as a much more resilient way of doing it than having very sort of delicate little plants with little micro hydroponic systems.
I mean, there's a famous one at Point Hill, which is covered in Virginia creepers. It's famous around here, and it's been there for 300 years. You kind of go like, But, I think there's always this desire. I'm not, people haven't got any patience. It takes time for Virginia creepers to take over a building,
Well, yeah, like this is why you couldn't just plant. You're going to plant plants up a wall anyway.
Yeah.
I don't see why you can't plant a series of climbing plants up a wall.
Yeah.
And then each one you have to grow 2 meters rather than 20 meters. And you're going to get sort of more sustainable plants a lot quicker.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also it has to be partially irrigated in some way or another, but that seems to be a better way of doing it than having, like I say, these delicate little systems.
Yeah, I mean, the plants aren't, they're relatively robust. They just need a lot of water, that's all, and so I don't mean it's delicate, as in like that. But just on that climbing thing, I mean, it's interesting, and it's segueing back to Roos, because 120 Fenchurch Street, which is open to the public in normal times without an appointment, it's not like the Sky Gardens where you have to book. It's free to go on. I was actually involved years ago, I was brought in to advise which company should win the landscape prize, to do it, And it was done by Latz and Partners. So when it first went in, people were saying, well, it's not very, very green dusty, is it? And they've got all these frames, haven't they? I said, yeah, because they're frames for the wisteria. And it's going to take about 10 years for the wisteria to actually completely cover. But it's actually a really sensible design, because actually that wisteria will last forever. Yeah. And, it's got all its biodiversity benefits, blah, blah, blah. Slowly does well. It's the same with green roofs. Seed them, don't mat them. Yeah. Nature is better at deciding what it wants to do on a roof than us. Yeah.
Well, my sort of gardening philosophy is sort of throw as much things up the ground and see what grows, in the same way you throw things in the mud and see what sticks.
Yeah, I'm not. See, I've got to do this, and I know I upset another bunch of people. I do not believe, I've not seen ever. Well, basically, there's a lot of architects specifying wildflower turfs as biodiverse green roofs.
So it's a wildflower turf, but then already grown.
Pre-grown, put it up. Doesn't work. But what they want is instant green. And the best green roofs are where you seed them. And that's where I get my prop. If anybody follows me on LinkedIn, I spent for 22 years, I spent the summer collecting seeds. I collect seeds from anywhere, all sorts of places, all around South East London, Kent, because I'm from there. And these seeds, the last 3 years, most of the seeds have gone onto the far roof at IKEA, which was originally installed as brown roof. And fortunately, for whatever reasons, I'm allowed access to it. And it is now, I put it on LinkedIn and people say, that is a beautiful green roof. I've got people at IKEA saying, I want to turn my garden into that. It was bare in 2018. It was semi-bare in 2019. It was 3/4 bare in 2020. And it's nearly 80% covered in vegetation. That is seeds that I've collected. Now, I love doing that. But the point of it is to say to architects, get the seeds in, let the plants do what they want to do. Stop forcing it onto...
Well, it's because the architect wants the pretty photos as soon as the building's finished to go on their website and move on to the next project. Yeah. They don't want to have to wait for 6 months or 12 months for those seeds to establish themselves.
But philosophically, what you've just described is they want their product, their photograph before they move on. Everything that I'm involved in is about what is the process and what is the function. It's not what the product is. So a good building is a building that's designed to function for 40 years in terms of those green roofs. Yeah. If you put a pre-grown thing in there to get your photograph, you have not created an ecosystem services green roof, in my view. Now, I know I'm going to upset a lot of people in the green roof industry who grow pre-grown systems, I'm on record. Everybody knows that I'm not a fan of them.
Yeah, well, I fully intend to take a picture of every building I ever do, at least every year, if not more, as long as I'm alive, and then have a time lapse of this is what it was when it was built.
Yeah.
And then it was established, more established, blah, 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 and then 50 years time or whatever, you've got a beautifully established sort of complete system, or continuing to develop system. And I think you're right that it's that instant need for something to be finished, rather than allowing it to actually accept that there's like a temporal dimension to all that leads into it. Yeah. The last thing I wanted to ask you about was what you had a little event on the other day, Rewilding.
Oh yeah. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that.
Which is a very fashionable term now, and I know that I don't know if you've read Isabella Tree's book, Wilding, which is one of the net people who runs net.
Yeah.
What's your perception or perspective on rewilding as a sort of fashionable thing that's coming out, and where you see it developing and integrating into your work and more generally?
Well, I mean, I think I've been rewilding London for 23 years, so I do. There's quite a few of us, so it's not just me, but most of my work has been about rewilding London. The interesting thing that came out of that Reaver event, actually, and there's Jan from Heel now, and it's not aimed at her. We had this conversation, but so I've been filming these bee walls on these dry paths on Blackheath, which are made by human beings. And I've always been fascinated to challenge my own community that actually human beings are part of the ecological system. And so if I may quickly segue, because it's very important, the ecologists say, when they put the walls back into the Yosemite, when the Yosemite was founded, the first thing that happened, they kicked out the Shinonan, which are the indigenous tribe, So when they put the walls back in, there are ecologists in the Yosemite saying there's only one thing that's missing from the Yosemite's ecology, and that's the Shoshonan. But they were kicked out because humans were bad, right? So we had this conversation. She said, well, they're only doing that in the paths, Dusty, because there's no big mammals wandering around the United Kingdom to create those kind of dry paths. And I was kind of like, this is what we do. We go back to this lost Eden where there were bison roaming around the United Kingdom, or wolves or lynx or whatever, which I'm all for. Lynx being put back into the country because they have a good ecological function at killing deer. I don't want to put them back for some romantic notion of nonsense. So
the deer population is the highest it's been for 1,000 years.
Exactly. Yeah, so having lynx back is a really good idea. Having, I don't know, bison wandering, I just kind of like,
Green Woods, just north of Canterbury,
They are, and I'm from there, and I used to bird watch in Bleak Woods, but yeah. But, as long as they serve an ecological function and they are useful to the ecosystem today and in the future, I'm fine about it. If it's actually about some romantic idea that we can get back to before the fossil fuel age, I'm going, and this is why I always have a conflict with my own sector. There's this trying to get back to some lost paradise. I'm not interested in the lost paradise. I'm interested in the paradise of the future. So rewilding for me, I think what they're doing at NEP is great, and it's a rural context, and I think it's fantastic, and I'd love to go there one day. But rewilding in a city context will be slightly different. And we are always going to have cities. We're going to have more cities, and more people are going to live in cities. And in a way, rewilding cities is actually far more important because it's where people are going to live. And I'm quite keen that the positive side of human beings, as part of ecology, is clocked. Coppicing is a very, very important thing in East Blean Wood for the heath fertility. If you didn't have coppicing, you wouldn't have the heath fertility. That is a human activity. And I think sometimes in my sector, it's like, we're going to go back to some lost Eden. Not interested. So the rewilding thing has really got me thinking the last 3 days when I walk around Blackheath, and Blackheath is essentially a man-made habitat. A lot of people think it's some